Welcome to Clandestine Cases,
where every story is a new mystery waiting to be solved. Grab a coffee, stay curious, and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Let's get started with Miss Marple and the Tea Party Massacre. Chapter 1. An Invitation to Murder. The village of St. Mary Mead was at its loveliest in late spring, when the roses in cottage gardens spilled their perfume into the air and ivy-clad houses drowsed in the afternoon sun. The grandest house in the district, Greystone Manor, sat atop a gentle rise, its stone facade softened by climbing wisteria and neatly trimmed hedgerows. It was here, at the invitation of Lady Beatrice Redmayne, that the village's most notable residents gathered for an afternoon tea, a social occasion that was to be remembered for reasons far beyond its elegant arrangements. Lady Beatrice, a woman of considerable means and a formidable reputation, had spared no expense in the preparations. Beneath a white marquee on the lawn, crisp linen-draped tables bore fine bone china, tiered trays laden with scones and cucumber sandwiches, and an array of delicate pastries prepared by her French cook, Monsieur Pelletier. A maid moved silently among the guests, refilling cups with steaming Darjeeling. The air hummed with the pleasant murmur of conversation, yet beneath the veneer of civility, tensions rippled like an undercurrent beneath still waters. Seated at the head of the gathering, Lady Beatrice surveyed her guests with the keen gaze of one who enjoyed her position as both hostess and ruler of St. Mary Mead's social scene. There was Colonel Marchbanks, a retired officer with an inclination for strong opinions and even stronger whiskey. His much younger wife, Cecilia, who seemed unusually pale despite the afternoon warmth. Beside them sat Reverend Collins, his brow furrowed in perpetual concern, while his wife, a woman of delicate constitution and nervous disposition, twisted a lace handkerchief between her fingers. A few seats away, Lawrence Denning, a well-dressed yet faintly disreputable man of business, conversed in hushed tones with Miss Arabella Henshaw, a widow of considerable fortune and uncertain morals. Dr. Cartwright, whose sharp eyes missed nothing, observed the scene with an air of professional detachment, while young Henry Redmayne, Lady Beatrice's nephew and sole heir, lounged indolently in his chair, flicking imaginary dust from his cufflinks. And then there was Miss Marple. Seated quietly at the edge of the gathering, her knitting needles clicking softly, she listened rather than spoke, content to let the conversation weave its own tangled threads. She had long understood that in a village such as this, it was not always what was said that mattered, but rather what was left unsaid. The first sign of discord came when Lady Beatrice, lifting her teacup with careful precision, fixed her gaze upon Lawrence Denning. "I believe you have some business in London next week, Mr. Denning?" she asked smoothly. Denning's fingers tightened slightly around his spoon before he smiled. "I do indeed, Lady Beatrice. Business that should prove rather profitable." "Ah," she said, her expression one of polite indifference. "I rather thought your business affairs had taken an unfortunate turn. How fortunate that your luck has improved." A moment's silence followed, broken only by the sound of china softly clinking against saucers. Then Colonel Marchbanks chuckled, the sound brittle and forced. "Denning's luck, it seems, is always a matter of convenience," he remarked. Miss Marple noted the slight flush that crept up Denning's neck, the way his jaw tightened momentarily before he forced another easy smile. There was something there, something simmering beneath the surface. Across the table, Cecilia Marchbanks reached for her tea with unsteady hands, spilling a few drops onto the pristine tablecloth. Her husband did not appear to notice, too absorbed in a heated discussion with Dr. Cartwright regarding the effects of arsenic poisoning. a subject that seemed curiously ill-suited to the occasion. As the conversation drifted from trivial gossip to weightier matters, Lady Beatrice's own demeanor remained poised, but her glances toward certain guests betrayed a deeper intent. There was, Miss Marple observed, an almost theatrical quality to her remarks, as though she were deliberately provoking, testing the reactions of those assembled. Then, just as the maid leaned over to pour another round of tea, Lady Beatrice gave a sudden, sharp gasp. Her fingers convulsed around the handle of her cup. Her lips parted in what might have been the beginning of a word. But before any sound could escape, her body stiffened. A moment later, she slumped forward, knocking the delicate china from the table, sending it crashing to the grass. A stunned silence gripped the gathering. For a moment, no one moved, as if the world itself had paused to comprehend the scene before them. Then, Dr. Cartwright leapt to his feet, rushing to Lady Beatrice's side. He pressed 2 fingers to her throat, his brow furrowing, before looking up, his face grave. "She's dead," he announced. A collective gasp rippled through the guests. Cecilia Marchbanks covered her mouth with a trembling hand. Lawrence Denning stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the stone patio. Miss Marple, however, merely watched, her knitting needles resting motionless in her lap. The village of St. Mary Mead had seen its Dundee fair share of scandals, whispered secrets, and minor intrigues, but murder was quite another matter. And this, Miss Marple was certain, was murder. The only question remaining was why and by whose hand. Chapter 2. A most unsavory death. For a moment, the silence was absolute. Lady Beatrice's lifeless form slumped forward, her elegant hand still clutching the delicate porcelain cup that now lay shattered upon the lawn. The afternoon sun, so warm and inviting only moments before, seemed suddenly too bright, too harsh, casting sharp shadows across the assembled guests, each frozen in a tableau of shock and horror. Then, as though released from a spell, the scene erupted into movement. Cecilia Marchbanks gave a strangled cry, her hands flying to her mouth as she turned away, while her husband, Colonel Marchbanks, rose swiftly from his chair, barking orders at no one in particular. Dr. Cartwright had already moved to Lady Beatrice's side, pressing his fingers to her throat with a he. Physicians practiced efficiency. His expression darkened almost immediately. "There is nothing to be done," he said, his voice grim. "She is dead." A collective murmur swept through the gathering. Lawrence Denning, his usual air of indifference shaken, exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple as though suddenly afflicted with a headache. Miss Arabella Henshaw let out a theatrical gasp, clutching the arm of her chair. Reverend Collins, pale and wide-eyed, began murmuring a prayer under his breath, while his wife clutched at his sleeve, barely suppressing her own distress. Miss Marple, who had not moved from her seat, observed the scene with quiet intensity. Her sharp blue eyes flickered from face to face, noting the instinctive reactions, the hurried glances, the way Henry Redmayne's fingers toyed absently with the silver cufflink at his wrist, his usual insouciance now overlaid with something unreadable. She had seen many deaths in her time, natural, accidental, and those that were quite the opposite. And this, she had no doubt, belonged firmly to the latter category. Dr. Cartwright removed his spectacles, polishing them absent-mindedly on his handkerchief before turning to the group. "She choked, perhaps," he offered hesitantly, though even as he spoke, his frown deepened. "Or—" "No," Miss Marple said quietly. The single word cut through the disordered mutterings, drawing all eyes to her. She lifted her gaze from the lifeless form of Lady Beatrice and looked instead at the teacup that had spilled its contents onto the crisp white tablecloth. The delicate floral pattern had already begun to stain, a dark patch spreading outward. I do not believe it was a natural death. There was a pause before Lawrence Denning gave a short, humorless laugh. "Come now, Miss Marple," he said, though his voice held a faint unease. "Surely you don't mean to suggest—" "Poison," Dr. Cartwright interrupted, his tone now laced with certainty. Yes, it is possible. The way she clutched at her throat, the suddenness of it. There are substances that act swiftly, very swiftly indeed. The word sent another ripple of unease through the guests. Poison! It had a certain unmistakable finality to it. Unlike a dagger or a pistol, poison was insidious, slipping past defenses unnoticed until it was far too late. And poison, Miss Marple knew, required deliberation, planning, an intimate knowledge of both the victim and the means of delivery. Her gaze swept over the assembled guests. The tea had been poured from the same pot. The cups had been filled indiscriminately, carried by the maid from guest to guest. And yet, only Lady Beatrice had fallen. That suggested intent. The poison had not been in the pot itself, but had been placed in her cup specifically, which meant someone in this very group had done it. Colonel Marchbanks cleared his throat, his military training reasserting itself as he sought to restore some order. "We must send for the authorities at once." "Yes," Dr. Cartwright agreed, "but in the meantime, no one should leave." His eyes flickered toward the grand house beyond the garden. The staff should be questioned, of course, and the tea, the remains of it, must be preserved for examination. The mention of the tea drew a murmur from the guests, and, as if suddenly recalling their own cups, several hastily set them aside, as though fearful of what they might contain. Cecilia Marchbanks, still visibly shaken, turned to Miss Marple with wide eyes. But who would do such a thing? Why would anyone? Miss Marple gave a small sigh, folding her hands primly in her lap. "Oh, my dear, those are the only questions that matter, are they not? A murder was not an impulsive thing, not a sudden act of passion like the stab of a knife in the dark. It required thought, preparation, and above all, a reason. And if there was one thing Miss Marple had learned over the years, it was that murderers always had reasons, though they were not always the ones they claimed. She studied the faces before her, noting the barely concealed flickers of emotion. Fear, calculation, guilt. One of them, she knew, had deliberately placed a fatal dose into Lady Beatrice's cup, watching her sip, waiting for the inevitable. The question was, who had the most to gain from her death? And who, among them, was next? Chapter 3. The Guest List of Secrets. The air inside Greystone Manor had grown heavy, thick with the scent of wilting flowers and the weight of something unspoken. Outside, the late afternoon sun slanted through the leaded windows, casting long, wavering shadows upon the polished oak floor. The tea party, which had begun with such genteel civility, had descended into something else entirely. An uneasy gathering of suspects, each unwilling to meet the eyes of the others for too long. Lady Beatrice was dead, and the knowledge of that fact sat among them like an uninvited guest. Miss Marple, sitting primly in a high-backed chair near the window, had not spoken much since the incident. Her hands rested lightly on her lap, her knitting untouched, though the needles still lay in readiness beside her. She had seen much in her time, scandals, betrayals, and more than a few untimely deaths. But even she had to admit, there was something particularly unsettling about a poisoning. It was a quiet sort of murder, deliberate and intimate, requiring forethought and, more importantly, access. Dr. Cartwright, who had taken temporary charge of the A situation, had advised that the guests remain where they were until the authorities arrived. It was a logical suggestion, but one that clearly sat ill with more than a few. Lawrence Denning had made no attempt to conceal his irritation, pacing the room with restless energy, his polished shoes tapping sharply against the floor. "This is absurd," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Sitting here as if we're waiting for a funeral." Cecilia Marchbanks, who had grown increasingly pale as the afternoon progressed, sat stiffly in her chair, her hands folded in her lap with an effort that seemed almost painful. "Lady Beatrice is dead," she murmured, her voice brittle. "There will be a funeral." Her husband, Colonel Marchbanks, gave her a sharp glance, his lips pressing into a thin line. He had been uncharacteristically quiet since the doctor's pronouncement, his usual blustering manner subdued. It was not grief that silenced him. Miss Marple was certain of that, but something else, something less easily named. Miss Arabella Henshaw had taken up residence near the mantelpiece, her dark eyes flicking from person to person with barely concealed curiosity. She had always enjoyed a good scandal, but this was something else entirely. "A dreadful business," she said at last, her voice hushed, but not without a certain relish. "One hears of such things in novels, of course, but to have it happen here, in St. Mary Mead—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "And to Lady Beatrice, of all people." "She had enemies," Lawrence Denning remarked, without looking up from the fire, where he now stood with his hands clasped behind his back. There was a silence after that. No one wished to be the first to agree, but neither could they deny it. Lady Beatrice had been a formidable woman, well-connected and well-respected, but not, Miss Marple reflected, universally loved. And if she had been murdered, and there was no longer any doubt that she had, it was surely by someone who had nursed a grievance long enough to act upon it. Reverend Collins shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearing his throat. "It would be prudent," he said cautiously, "to remember that we are speaking of a departed soul. Whatever her faults, she deserves our respect." "A dead woman deserves many things," Dr. Cartwright said flatly, "chiefly justice." Miss Marple watched the doctor closely. He was a practical man, accustomed to dealing with the frailties of the human body, but he was not, she thought, entirely without sentiment. His expression, as he studied the group before him, was not merely clinical. He was weighing them, assessing them, just as she was. And then there was Henry Redmayne, young, charming in a careless sort of way, and the sole heir to Lady Beatrice's estate. He had not spoken much since her collapse, but he had not seemed particularly shocked either. Grief, Miss Marple had observed, manifested in many ways, but there was something about Henry's demeanor that troubled her. A lack of urgency, perhaps. A lack of concern. "You are very quiet, Henry," she said at last, and the young man glanced up, startled, as though he had momentarily forgotten where he was. "Am I?" He gave her a quick smile, though it did not quite reach his eyes. "I suppose I'm still processing. My aunt was not the easiest woman to love, you know." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "And yet, she was your benefactress." Henry's smile tightened. "Yes," he said. "That, too." The hurried conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, brisk and assured. A moment later, the door swung open, and Inspector Graves of the County Constabulary stepped inside, his expression grim. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the uneasy silence, "I regret to inform you that this is now a murder inquiry." No one is to leave until further notice. A collective breath was drawn, and once again Miss Marple observed the faces around her. Not for the first time, she reflected that a village such as St. Mary Mead held many secrets beneath its genteel surface. And somewhere among these whispered scandals and old grudges lay the answer to a very simple, very deadly question. Who had poisoned Lady Beatrice? Chapter 4. Alibis and Anxieties. The drawing-room at Greystone Manor had taken on the quality of a stage, its unwilling players cast in roles not of their choosing. Inspector Graves, a man of unshakable patience and a keen eye for deception, had settled himself in the high-backed chair that Lady Beatrice had occupied only hours earlier. It was an unsettling thing to see a new occupant in that imposing seat, a stark reminder that its former mistress was no longer among them. The guests, now suspects in a most deliberate murder, had been arranged about the room, each waiting to be called forward, each balancing carefully upon the line between composure and fear. Miss Marple, as was her way, had placed herself at a small table near the window, her knitting in her lap, though her hands remained still. She had long observed that people, when questioned, often said far more than they intended, not merely with words, but with the tremor of a hand, the flicker of an eyelid, the too hasty denial. It was an old lesson, learned in the many years she had spent among the quiet intrigues of St. Mary Mead, and it had served her well. The questioning began with Colonel Marchbanks, who sat stiffly in his chair, his hands upon his knees, like a soldier awaiting orders. "I was speaking with Dr. Cartwright at the time," he said crisply. "We were discussing medical matters. Arsenic, I believe." His jaw tightened slightly as he realized how that must sound. Purely in an academic sense, of course. Inspector Graves regarded him levelly. "And you saw nothing unusual? No one tampering with Lady Beatrice's cup?" "No." A pause. "That is to say, I was not watching her specifically." Dr. Cartwright gave a slow nod. "The Colonel speaks the truth. We were deep in conversation. I recall that Lady Beatrice had just made some remark, something pointed, I believe, before she raised her cup." "Pointed?" "A comment about business affairs, directed at Mr. Denning." Inspector Graves turned his gaze toward Lawrence Denning, who had been listening to the exchange with thinly veiled impatience. "And what was this comment?" Denning smiled, but there was little warmth in it. "She suggested, rather unkindly, that my financial situation was not as secure as I had led people to believe." He leaned back in his chair. It was not an uncommon theme with Lady Beatrice. She had a talent for wounding people just where it hurt the most. "And did it hurt you, Mr. Denning?" Denning's smile tightened. "I imagine it would be more concerning if I said no. But I assure you, Inspector, I did not kill her over an unpleasant remark. I have been the subject of far worse." Miss Marple noted the flicker of tension in his posture. A man who had been put on the defensive, yet, whether by guilt or by mere irritation, it was difficult to say. Cecilia Marchbanks was next, her delicate hands clasped in her lap, her face pale and drawn. I was speaking with Miss Henshaw at the time," she said softly. "She was telling me about a trip she once took to Italy." Miss Arabella Henshaw nodded at once. "Yes, we were discussing Florence. The palaces, the art, such beauty, Inspector. I had quite lost myself in describing it." "Which means neither of you saw anything untoward?" Miss Henshaw shook her head. "Nothing at all. One moment Lady Beatrice was speaking, and the next—" She made a small, expressive gesture with her hands. It was quite dreadful. Henry Redmayne was called forward, his air of insouciance somewhat dampened, though he managed a careless shrug. I was listening to the conversation, but I wasn't really paying attention. My aunt often held court in that way, making her little pronouncements, watching to see who would squirm. He gave a half-smile. I expect she got rather more of a reaction than she intended. And your tea? What about it? Did you drink any? Henry hesitated. Number Y. I don't particularly care for tea. I had sherry instead. Inspector Graves made a note in his book. And the maid? This is Mrs. Finch's girl, is it not? The one who poured the tea? Yes, Henry said. A timid little thing. Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, spoke up then, her voice firm with the quiet authority of one who had kept a house running, smoothly, for decades. That's Lily, sir, and I can vouch for her. A good girl, she is. Not the sort to be mixed up in something like this. No one is ever the sort, Mrs. Finch, until they are, the inspector said evenly. Nevertheless, she will need to be questioned. A hush had fallen over the room, the weight of scrutiny pressing upon them all. Miss Marple allowed herself a moment to consider the patterns forming before her. The colonel and the doctor, deeply engrossed in discussion. Cecilia, Marchbanks, and Miss Henshaw, conveniently absorbed in their own little world. Henry, not drinking tea at all. Denning, stung by a public remark. A list of alibis, each neatly aligning, each carefully constructed. Too carefully. It was always the way of things. People remembered only what was useful to remember, forgot what was inconvenient, and sometimes they fabricated entirely. Somewhere among the assembled guests, in the tangled web of alibis and anxieties, lay the truth, and Miss Marple intended to find it. Chapter 5. A Spoonful of Deception. The morning after Lady Beatrice's murder dawned with an unsettling quietness over St. Mary Mead. The once splendid tea party had disbanded into a house filled with whispered conversations and uneasy glances. Greystone Manor, usually a place of rigid order and impeccable decorum, had become the unwilling center of a scandal that no amount of social influence could suppress. Inspector Graves had returned early, his manner brisk and businesslike, a man determined to extract the truth. And, as was often the case, the truth had begun to reveal itself in the most unexpected of places. It was the maid, Lily, who discovered the first clue. She had been tasked with clearing the tea service from the lawn, and though much had already been put in order, she noticed something peculiar. A sugar bowl, slightly out of place. It had been left not on the main serving table where it ought to have been, but near the far end of the seating, arrangement, almost hidden among the folds of the tablecloth. More curiously, the small silver spoon that accompanied it had a faint white residue clinging to its surface. It was a minor detail, but enough to send a shiver of apprehension through the girl. She had heard the hushed speculation, the talk of poison. And now, a sugar bowl so strangely misplaced. It was enough to make her report her find to Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, who, in turn, brought it to Inspector Graves. The inspector examined the item with care, turning the spoon in his hands. The sugar within the bowl appeared undisturbed, yet there was something undeniably odd about its presence so far from where the tea had been poured. A quiet murmur ran through the assembled household staff as he tested the residue with the tip of his finger, sniffing it before discarding the notion of sugar. It was not sweet. It was something else. The second clue came in the form of an empty vial, discovered in the waste bin of the Waybe guest bathroom on the first floor. It was a small glass bottle, its label torn, but enough remained to identify it as something medicinal. Dr. Cartwright was called to examine it, and after a moment's consideration, he announced that the traces within suggested a powerful sedative, one that, in the wrong dosage, could prove fatal. "Not an obvious poison," he remarked, peering at the bottle with professional detachment, "but, if mixed into a drink, especially with something strong-tasting like tea, it might go unnoticed." The implications were immediate. Someone had introduced the substance into Lady Beatrice's cup, perhaps through the sugar. And there, sitting upon the sideboard in plain view, was the prime suspect, the misplaced sugar bowl, practically signposting its role in the crime. The guests had gathered once more in the drawing-room, their expressions wary as the inspector presented his findings. Suspicion settled heavily upon Cecilia Marchbanks, who had been seated nearest to where the sugar bowl had been found. She had, by her own admission, been speaking with Miss Henshaw during the tea, their conversation drifting, perhaps conveniently, away from the commotion. More to the point, as Inspector Graves soon uncovered, Cecilia had visited the guest bathroom just before tea was served. "A nervous disposition," her husband explained brusquely, his mustache twitching with irritation. "She often takes something to calm herself." "Does she indeed?" Inspector Graves said, mildly. "And where might she have procured such a thing?" Dr. Cartwright cleared his throat. "I have prescribed Mrs. Marchbanks a mild sedative in the past, yes. But what was in that vial was not a mild sedative. It was something far stronger." All eyes turned to Cecilia, who had grown even paler than before. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, she pressed a gloved hand to her temple, as though overwhelmed by the weight of the accusation. Miss Marple, who had been watching the proceedings with great interest, did not share the room's air of certainty. It was all very neat, very convincing, but perhaps too much so. Murder, as she had long observed, was rarely so obliging in its presentation of evidence. The sugar bowl, so conveniently placed, the vial discarded where it could be easily found, such things did not speak of a careful, calculating mind. They suggested something else entirely. Inspector Graves was prepared to take Cecilia into custody, but Miss Marple, in her usual gentle manner, coughed lightly and addressed him. "If I might trouble you for a moment, Inspector." The room fell silent as all eyes turned toward the elderly lady, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression as mild as ever. "It is a curious thing, is it not," she continued, "that a person intending to poison should do so in such a very obvious manner?" Graves frowned. "You believe Mrs. Marchbanks is innocent?" "I do not say that," Miss Marple corrected him. "I merely say that there is something rather deliberate about all this. Consider, if one intended to poison Lady Beatrice secretly, why choose a method so immediately traceable? Why leave a vial to be discovered? Why tamper with sugar when the tea itself could have been dosed far more easily?" The question hung in the air, unsettling in its simplicity. Miss Marple had seen many such cases before, where clues were left as breadcrumbs, leading investigators exactly where the murderer intended. And she could not help but feel that they were all being led. Cecilia Marchbanks looked at Miss Marple with wide, pleading eyes, but Miss Marple was not yet ready to clear her name. There were still pieces missing, still details that did not sit quite right. No, she thought, the murderer was not so clumsy. Somewhere in that room was the real culprit, someone who had taken great pains to ensure that suspicion fell upon another. And until she unraveled their scheme, she would not allow an innocent party to take the blame. Murder, after all, was often committed with a steady hand. But deception? That required true finesse. Chapter 6. Whispers in the Rose Garden. The gardens of Greystone Manor were at their most bewitching in the moonlight. The heavy scent of roses hung thick in the air, their pale petals luminous against the night, while the distant hoot of an owl punctuated the silence with a sense of foreboding. The house itself loomed behind the manicured hedgerows, its grand windows reflecting slivers of silver light. It was a night for secrets, the kind that thrived under cover of darkness, and Miss Marple, for all her unassuming presence, was an inveterate listener. She had come outside under the pretense of enjoying the night air, having excused herself from the drawing-room where Inspector Graves remained in deep discussion with Dr. Cartwright. The events of the day had left the household tense, the accusations against Cecilia Marchbanks hovering uncomfortably in the air. It had all seemed a little too easy, a little too deliberate, and Miss Marple, with years of experience in human nature, did not trust an answer that presented itself so readily. There was more to uncover, she was certain of it. As she strolled past the trellised archway leading into the rose garden, a sound caught her attention. A hushed voice, urgent and strained, carried on the cool night breeze. She paused, her instincts immediately sharpening. In a village such as St. Mary Mead, one learned quickly that the most valuable truths were seldom spoken in broad daylight. Moving with a care that belied her years, she stepped behind a tall hedgerow, positioning herself so that she could hear without being seen. "Do you think they suspect?" The voice was low, barely above a whisper. It belonged to a man, though the slight tremor betrayed unease. "They suspect everyone," came the reply, a woman's voice, smooth yet edged with irritation. "That is the nature of these things. We mustn't be foolish." There was a pause, and then the man exhaled sharply. "This is dangerous, more dangerous than I imagined. Perhaps it would be best if we left—" "No," the woman interrupted sharply. "That would be the worst thing we could do. Leaving would only confirm what they already think." A rustle of fabric, the sound of someone shifting in agitation. "I never meant for this to happen." "Nor did I," the woman said, her voice dropping to a near hiss. "But here we are." Miss Marple remained, perfectly still, her mind working swiftly. The voices were familiar, though in the hush of the night she could not yet be certain to whom they belonged. What was clear, however, was that they were not speaking of an abstract worry, but of something real, something dangerous. They were hiding something. Another silence, heavier this time, before the woman spoke again. "We have to be careful. They found the vial, but that means nothing. Yet." The man let out a ragged breath. "And if they do find proof?" A long pause. Then, coldly, "Then we must be prepared." Miss Marple remained frozen in place, her breath barely stirring the night air. The conversation had all the markings of collusion, of a desperate attempt to maintain control. And yet, what intrigued her most was the unmistakable air of panic. Whoever these two were, they had not expected the investigation to unfold as it had. There was guilt, certainly. But what sort of guilt? That was the question. A sharp snap of a twig made her stiffen. One of them had moved abruptly, perhaps sensing something amiss. Miss Marple did not dare remain any longer. With the lightest step she could manage, she withdrew along the path, careful not to disturb the gravel beneath her feet. When she reached the safety of the house, she allowed herself a moment to gather her thoughts. The words she had overheard were revealing, but they were not yet conclusive. If anything, they only deepened the mystery. The misplaced sugar bowl, the vial in the waste bin. These things had seemed so conveniently placed, as though someone wanted the investigation to proceed along a particular path. And now, whispers in the dark, fraught with tension and unspoken threats. Miss Marple smoothed a hand over her skirt, her expression serene as she stepped back into the warm glow of the drawing room. She had heard enough to know that the true murderer was still at large. More importantly, she now knew that there were two among them who feared discovery above all else. And fear, she knew, was a dangerous thing. It made people reckless, and in their recklessness, they would betray themselves. Chapter 7. The Butler's Unfinished Tale. The heavy curtains of Greystone Manor were drawn against the morning sun, casting long shadows across the drawing-room where the household once again gathered in uneasy anticipation. Inspector Graves had summoned them early, his manner clipped and efficient, his patience worn thin by the labyrinthine twists this case had taken. There had been whispers in the village already, speculation running wild through the tea shops and market stalls. A poisoning was scandalous enough. But now there was something even more troubling. The butler, Mr. Jameson, was missing. It had been Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, who first raised the alarm. Mr. Jameson, who had served Lady Beatrice for more than 20 years, had failed to appear at his usual time to oversee the morning routine. The fire had not been laid in the study, the silverware had not been polished, and, most unusually, his room was empty. His neatly pressed uniform still hung on its hook, but there was no sign of his overnight bag, nor of the man himself. A thorough search of the house had yielded nothing, and by the time the inspector was notified, it had become quite clear. Jameson had vanished without a word. Miss Marple sat quietly in her chair, hands folded neatly in her lap, her sharp eyes scanning the assembled guests as the news was relayed. It was a curious thing, this disappearance, though not altogether surprising. She had observed Jameson keenly the night before, watching the way his gaze had flickered uncertainly toward the drawing-room doors, as though considering whether to speak. He had lingered just a moment too long after serving, listening with that quiet efficiency that so many in his profession possessed. And yet, something had kept him silent. Inspector Graves cleared his throat, his steely gaze sweeping over them. Mr. Jameson, as I understand it, was in Lady Beatrice's employ for quite some time. A man in such a position would have known her affairs well. Too well, perhaps. And now he is gone. He paused meaningfully. That suggests only two possibilities. Either he fled because he was guilty of something, or someone made certain he would not speak. A palpable tension settled over the room. Colonel Marchbanks shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm on the armrest. "Absurd," he muttered. Jameson was a loyal man. He wouldn't have abandoned his post without cause. Perhaps cause was given to him, Inspector Graves countered. He turned his gaze to Cecilia Marchbanks, who sat stiff-backed, her fingers twisting in the folds of her skirt. "You were seen speaking to Jameson last night, Mrs. Marchbanks. Might I ask what about?" Cecilia's head snapped up, her wide eyes momentarily betraying her. Nothing of importance," she said quickly. "He merely inquired if I had all I needed for the evening. It was quite routine." Miss Marple's knitting needles, which had been resting idly in her lap, twitched slightly. Routine. An interesting choice of words. She had seen Jameson hesitate in the doorway last night, had noticed the way his mouth had opened slightly, as though he meant to speak, but thought better of it. No, whatever conversation had taken place had not been so mundane. Lawrence Denning, who had remained unusually quiet, let out a slow breath and leaned back in his chair. "If you ask me, this is all rather too convenient. A man disappears just as he might have revealed something useful? That sounds to me as though someone wanted him out of the way." Or, Arabella Henshaw interjected smoothly, "He knew more than he ought, and took his chance to slip away before we could discover it." Henry Redmayne scoffed, the shadow of a smirk playing across his lips. "Jameson! Hardly the scheming sort. He was a butler, not a criminal mastermind." Miss Marple allowed the conversation to ebb and flow around her, absorbing every word, every slight hesitation, every too careful denial. It was a dangerous thing to assume too quickly, to believe that guilt belonged solely to the most obvious suspect. In her experience, the truth often lay hidden beneath layers of deception, carefully arranged to mislead those who did not care to look closely. But she did. It was not simply Jameson's absence that intrigued her. It was the timing of it. Why had he stayed silent last night, yet vanished before morning? Had he overheard something? Seen something? And, more importantly, had someone else realized it? The events of the past days had already proven one thing beyond doubt. Lady Beatrice's murderer was both careful and clever. If Jameson had posed a threat, it was not unthinkable that someone had taken steps to ensure his silence. Miss Marple cleared her throat gently, drawing all eyes to her. "One cannot help but wonder," she said mildly, "whether Mr. Jameson's disappearance is meant to be seen as precisely that, a disappearance. After all, if he were truly running away, one might expect more obvious signs of haste. A packed bag, perhaps. A missing sum of money. But instead, he has left behind all that a man might need to start anew, and taken only himself." Inspector Graves studied her keenly. "You mean to suggest he did not leave of his own accord?" Miss Marple's smile was faint, her gaze uncommonly shrewd. "Oh, I do not suggest it, Inspector. I am quite certain of it." A chill passed through the room at her words. No one spoke, but the implication settled heavily upon them all. If Jameson had not left willingly, then the alternative was far more sinister. Somewhere, in the quiet halls of Greystone Manor, something terrible had occurred in the dark of night. And if the butler had seen something that sealed his fate, then Miss Marple knew one thing with certainty. The murderer was growing desperate. And desperate people, she knew, always made mistakes. Chapter 8. A Letter Never Posted. The library of Greystone Manor was a solemn place, its tall shelves lined with books bound in leather and age. The heavy oak desk at its center bore the marks of years of use, its polished surface darkened with the oil from countless hands. It was here that Lady Beatrice had spent many of her evenings writing letters in a precise, slanting hand, and it was here that Miss Marple now found herself, drawn by a quiet curiosity that had been stirring at the back of her mind since the moment the murder had been committed. It was a simple thought, really. Lady Beatrice had been a woman of order, a woman who did not let matters go unattended. If she had felt herself to be in any sort of danger, or if she had uncovered something she was not meant to know, would she not have recorded it somewhere? Miss Marple had seen it before, in cases both great and small, the way the dying always sought to leave a trace. Some final attempt at ensuring the truth would not be buried with them. And so, while the rest of the household remained occupied with speculating over the disappearance of the butler, she had excused herself with quiet efficiency, slipping into the library under the pretense of looking for a book. The drawers of Lady Beatrice's desk were locked, but that was no true obstacle. Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, had been only too willing to supply the key, with a wary glance and a murmured insistence that she had not touched a thing since the Ibavi, ladies passing. It was clear that she wished nothing to do with whatever secrets might lie within, and Miss Marple did not blame her. The dead, after all, rarely left behind pleasant surprises. She went through the contents methodically. Neatly stacked correspondence, an account's ledger, various invitations to social engagements long past. And then, at the back of the bottom drawer, something that gave her pause. A torn envelope, yellowed at the edges, its paper rough and worn as though handled, more than once. There was no address upon it, no stamp, only a few hastily scrawled words in Lady Beatrice's unmistakable hand. To be sent immediately. Miss Marple frowned slightly, extracting the envelope with the delicate care of someone accustomed to preserving things that might soon be lost. The letter inside was half-written, the ink smudged in one corner, as though the writer had hesitated mid-sentence. She read the words carefully, her brow furrowing ever so slightly as the meaning settled into place. I have made a grave mistake. I see that now. I should never have trusted— The sentence ended abruptly, the last few strokes of the pen trailing off into nothingness. Miss Marple turned the paper over, seeking more, but there was nothing. No signature, no further explanation, only the stark implication that Lady Beatrice had realized too late that she was in danger. And yet, the letter had never been sent. A soft rustling from the doorway made her glance up, just in time to see Henry Redmayne leaning casually against the frame, watching her with the faintest trace of amusement. You do have a knack for finding things, don't you, Miss Marple? She smiled, folding the letter with deliberate care before slipping it back into its envelope. One does try, dear boy. His gaze flickered briefly to the desk, to the open drawer, before returning to her with a look of mild curiosity. And what is it you've found this time? Merely an unfinished letter, she replied, smoothly. A most interesting one, I should think. Henry tilted his head slightly, as though weighing his response. My aunt did enjoy her correspondence, always writing letters, even when a simple word would do. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. But this one, I believe, was rather different. It was never posted, you see. That suggests she was interrupted. His expression did not change, but she noticed the faint tightening of his jaw, the slight twitch of his fingers at his side. A subtle reaction, almost imperceptible. But there, nonetheless. How very unfortunate, he murmured. Miss Marple merely inclined her head. There were few things in life she trusted more than instinct, and her instinct told her that this letter was of significance. The question was, had Lady Beatrice been about to reveal something that would have led to her death? Or had she simply realized, too late, that her trust had been misplaced? Either way, it seemed that someone had been desperate to ensure that whatever she had been about to say would never be heard. And that, Miss Marple thought with quiet certainty, made it all the more important that she listen. Chapter 9. The Gathering Storm. The air inside Greystone Manor was thick with the weight of expectation. Outside, dark clouds had gathered over St. Mary Mead, casting a heavy gloom upon the manicured gardens. The distant rumble of thunder echoed through the valley, a low and ominous murmur, as if the very sky itself anticipated what was to come. Within the drawing-room, the household had been assembled, each seated in stiff-backed chairs, arranged in a careful semicircle, as though awaiting judgment. And at the center of it all, as serene as ever, sat Miss Marple, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Inspector Graves stood by the fireplace, arms crossed, his face unreadable. He had taken a step back now, letting the little old lady from the village take the lead. He had seen enough to know that beneath the gentle demeanor and soft voice lay a mind as sharp as any he had encountered. She had asked for this gathering, and so it had been arranged. Now, it was time to hear what she had uncovered. Miss Marple let her gaze drift slowly across the assembled guests, taking in each face with quiet scrutiny. Cecilia Marchbanks, pale and drawn, sat with her hands clenched tightly together, her husband beside her, his military bearing barely concealing his unease. Lawrence Denning lounged in his chair, affecting indifference, though his fingers drummed lightly against the armrest. Miss Arabella Henshaw, ever the observer, watched with an air of keen interest, while Henry Redmayne maintained his usual insouciance, though his eyes held something altogether less certain. Dr. Cartwright stood near the window, his features composed but tight with something unreadable. "An unpleasant business, murder," Miss Marple began gently, her voice carrying effortlessly in the silence. "It is, however, always a very simple thing when one looks at it properly. It begins, you see, with motive. A crack of thunder split the air, though no one stirred. When Lady Beatrice was killed, we all assumed, quite naturally, that it had been done by someone who stood to gain, perhaps financially, perhaps in reputation. Suspicion was thrown immediately in several directions. Young Henry, as the heir to her fortune. Mr. Denning, whom she had slighted publicly. Mrs. Marchbanks, whose nervous disposition and access to sedatives made her seem most unfortunate indeed. She paused, tilting her head slightly. And then, of course, there was the matter of the butler. A ripple of unease moved through the room. Jameson's disappearance had sent the investigation into further turmoil, providing a convenient distraction just when matters had begun to close in. Miss Marple continued. It seemed, at first, as though Jameson had fled. But I have lived long enough to know that men such as Jameson do not flee without reason. And when I overheard A.E. conversation in the rose garden, I knew that someone, perhaps more than one someone, was afraid of what he might reveal. A sharp breath was drawn, but no one spoke. Miss Marple's fingers traced the embroidery of her handkerchief as she went on. And then I found the letter. A letter never posted. A letter from Lady Beatrice herself, written in haste and fear, but never sent. I have made a grave mistake. I should never have trusted. She let the words hang in the air, watching the way Henry shifted in his chair, the way Cecilia's grip on her husband's hand tightened. It was clear then that Lady Beatrice had discovered something just before her death, something that frightened her. The question was, what? And more importantly, who? Her gaze settled upon Lawrence Denning, who met it with a small, humorless smile. "And you think I frightened her?" "Oh, no, Mr. Denning," Miss Marple said with quiet certainty. "Lady Beatrice was many things, but she was not easily frightened by men, such as yourself. No, what frightened her was something far closer to home, something she had believed to be true, only to realize, too late, that she had been deceived." A hush fell over the room. Even the storm seemed to pause, the distant rumbling fading into silence. "Greystone Manor is an old house," Miss Marple continued, "and old houses have long memories. Servants, too, are privy to much more than their employers realize. Jameson, I believe, had long suspected something was amiss. He was an observant man, as all good butlers are, and I believe he saw something. something that confirmed his suspicions on the very night of Lady Beatrice's death. A flicker of unease crossed Henry's face, but it was Dr. Cartwright who finally broke the silence. "This is all very compelling, Miss Marple," he said, his voice measured. "But what, exactly, are you suggesting?" Miss Marple turned to face him fully. "I am suggesting, Doctor, that the true murderer is someone who planned most carefully. Indeed, someone who knew that suspicion would fall upon others, someone who knew exactly how to use deception to their advantage." Her voice, still gentle, now carried the unmistakable weight of finality. "Lady Beatrice was poisoned, yes, but the poison was not in the sugar, nor in the tea. It was in something she alone would consume, something that would have seemed entirely ordinary, entirely safe." A sharp silence. "Her medicine." A gasp escaped Cecilia Marchbanks before she clapped a hand over her mouth. Colonel Marchbanks's expression darkened, while Lawrence Denning sat forward slightly, intrigue flickering in his eyes. Miss Marple's gaze remained on Dr. Cartwright. "You, Doctor, prescribed it yourself. A simple tonic, something she had taken for years. But on that day, someone altered it. A simple substitution, one that only someone with knowledge of chemistry would recognize. And as it so happens, you are the only one among us with such expertise." The doctor's face remained still, too still. And that, Miss Marple knew, was its own kind of confession. "There was no need to tamper with the tea," she continued. "No need for all those convenient distractions, the sugar bowl, the vial in the bin. Those were merely deceptions, meant to lead us astray. But the truth was always there, hidden in the simplest of places." A long silence followed, broken only by the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Then, at last, Dr. Cartwright exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "You are a remarkable woman, Miss Marple." And with that, the storm outside broke, rain lashing against the windows as the truth finally came to light. Chapter 10. The Last Cup of Tea. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the air crisp and the garden paths damp with the lingering traces of rain. Inside Greystone Manor, however, the tension had not lifted. The drawing-room was quiet, though not with the peaceful silence of a house at rest. It was the silence of expectation, of held breath and unspoken fear. The gathered guests sat in much the same places they had the day before, but now they were different, more wary, more watchful. The truth had begun to close in, and they all knew it. Miss Marple sat at the head of the room, her expression as mild as ever, her hands resting lightly on the armrests of her chair. Before her, on the delicate side table, sat a single, freshly poured cup of tea. It steamed gently, its rich aroma curling into the air, filling the space with the illusion of civility. She stirred it once, methodically, before looking up, her gaze sweeping across the room. "I always find," she said softly, "that the truth has a way of revealing itself in the most ordinary of moments. A misplaced sugar bowl, a letter never posted, a whisper in the garden, or, indeed, a simple cup of tea." She lifted the cup, as if in contemplation. Such an innocent thing, really. And yet, so often, tea has played its part in matters of crime. No one spoke. Even Henry, Redmayne, whose usual air of carelessness had not entirely abandoned him, seemed to sit a little straighter. Miss Marple took a measured sip before setting the cup down. "I suppose the great question now," she continued, "is whether the person responsible for Lady Beatrice's murder will care for a cup themselves." A flicker of movement, small, but enough. Dr. Cartwright's fingers, which had been resting idly on the arm of his chair, twitched slightly. His face remained composed, but his eyes— yes, his eyes betrayed him. Miss Marple smiled, just slightly. "You see, I have come to understand something very important about this case. It was never meant to be a mystery at all. No, the true crime here was intended to be so seamless, so perfectly executed, that no one would question it. A natural death, perhaps. A quiet passing, undisturbed by scandal. The trouble, of course, was that Lady Beatrice was not a woman who died quietly. A sharp intake of breath from Cecilia Marchbanks, but Miss Marple did not look her way. Instead, her attention remained on the doctor, who now sat very still. "It was you, Dr. Cartwright," she said gently. "From the very beginning. The poisoning was not the result of some hastily added substance, nor a last-minute opportunity taken in the heat of a quarrel. No, it was carefully planned, carefully administered, and most damning of all, it was expected. You knew precisely how Lady Beatrice would die, because you ensured it yourself." The doctor let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "An interesting theory, Miss Marple, but a theory is all it is." "Is it?" Her voice remained light, but her eyes were knowing. "And what of the medicine?" He said nothing. Miss Marple continued, "Oh yes, I checked. Lady Beatrice's tonic. She had taken it for years, trusted it implicitly. But the bottle she took from that morning was not the same. The formula had been altered, just slightly, just enough. It would have taken time, of course, and knowledge of chemistry. But who better than her own trusted physician?" A muscle in his jaw twitched. He did not look at her, but his fingers tightened ever so slightly around the armrest. "The sugar bowl, the vial in the waste bin, those were distractions," she said. "A clever touch, and one that very nearly worked. After all, when we find a vial of poison, do we not assume it was the means of murder? But the truth is far simpler. Lady Beatrice was already poisoned before she ever sat down to tea." "Lawrence." Denning let out a slow exhale, as if absorbing the weight of it. "And Jameson?" he asked. Miss Marple's expression turned just the slightest bit sad. Jameson had been loyal to Lady Beatrice for years, and in the end he saw what he was not meant to see. Or perhaps, more precisely, he knew something was not as it should be. A servant who knows the household well, who handles the lady's affairs. He would have noticed the change in the medicine. Perhaps he meant to speak up. And that, I fear, is why he disappeared. The words settled over the room like a heavy shroud. Outside, the sun had begun to break through the parting clouds, casting faint streaks of gold across the wet grass. Dr. Cartwright leaned forward slightly, folding his hands together. "And tell me, Miss Marple," he said, his voice still measured, still calm. "If what you say is true, then where is your proof?" Miss Marple's smile deepened. "Oh, I have no doubt that the police will find it," she said. "They will check the remaining contents of the bottle, of course, but they will also find something else. Records, likely. I dare say if one were to search your belongings thoroughly, one might even find notes. The sort that would not be intended for others to see." Dr. Cartwright studied her for a long moment. Then, quite suddenly, he let out a breath of laughter. "You truly are remarkable," he said. Miss Marple only inclined her head slightly. "I do try." Inspector Graves stepped forward then, his voice firm. "Dr. Cartwright, I'm afraid I must ask you to come with me." The doctor rose slowly, straightening his cuffs. He did not protest. He did not fight. He simply gave Miss Marple a small, knowing nod before allowing himself to be escorted from the room. When the door closed behind him, a breath seemed to release from the room all at once. Cecilia Marchbanks reached for her husband's hand, her shoulders trembling slightly. Lawrence Denning shook his head, as if still trying to process it all. Henry Redmayne, ever composed, poured himself another drink. Miss Marple, meanwhile, took another sip of her tea. It had gone slightly cold, but that was of little consequence. The case, after all, was closed.